It is, it's a very hard topic to talk about, I think. You know, someone sent me a note when I got back into climate change. I was chair of the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy under Prime Minister Martin, and not fired for some peculiar reason under Prime Minister Harper. And a lot of the work we were doing then was interesting because we were looking at the dynamics of the next 10, 20 years and how much had to happen over the last decade to reduce carbon emissions globally to avoid a catastrophe. And that decade, almost none of the things that we were being told by scientists back in 2003, 2004, 2005 happened. So now we're looking at, I'll give you the really depressing bad news up front, and I promise it'll get more positive as we go on. But I think part of the challenge we have is internalizing it, and I often described having so far survived the AIDS epidemic. I remember when I turned 20, AIDS was not a word, and when I turned 30, AIDS had taken 43 of my friends, all in their 20s. And that experience about the fragility of the balance just between a small retrovirus microorganism in the human body, how quickly one small adjustment or change in our ecosystem can be incredibly devastating. As you know, we're still living with 45 million people with AIDS in the world today. But that's not as big a challenge as climate change. You'll remember when we prepared for the Second World War in 1939, we had no Navy. By 1932, we built the third largest Navy in the world, and when Malaysia fell to the Japanese, we lost our rubber supply, and within 18 months, Canadian scientists invented artificial rubber, which we still use today. The scale of the restructuring of the economy in my hometown of Montreal, you know, my parents moved to the West Island, I used to remember driving in and out of the city or taking the train in and out for work, always going through that massive industrial complex in Lachine and in the Montreal West area, which used to produce a huge percentage of the tanks and aircraft to fight the Second World War. And that entire industrial complex was built in months almost to produce technologies and to create an economy that didn't exist. So climate change is a much more pervasive, bigger problem, and it's an existential crisis. We cannot survive as a species on this planet if it is 4 degrees Celsius warmer sometime this century. And right now we're tracking quite quickly for a 4 degrees Celsius warmer world, because the disruption of that to our planet is beyond the ability of people to adapt. And it's not just the changes in temperature, it's the speed at which they're happening that doesn't allow for any species to adapt. Plants can't adapt, animals can't adapt. You know, the combination of carbon dioxide at the levels it's already in the atmosphere not only are warming our oceans, we're also acidifying them, which is destroying our reefs, which really maintain 60% of the aquatic life in our oceans. We have half as many fish as we had when I was in high school in the 1970s. And the carbon dioxide levels we're dealing with right now are from before I was born. I mean, it's 17 degrees Celsius today in Toronto. It's hard to tell Canadians climate change is a problem because most of us got up this morning, as I did, jumped out in bed, and I said, my God, I can ride my bike, I don't even need a coat, right? The problems with that are the problems we had last winter, remembering carbon dioxide levels from the 1950s. January in BC, just over a year ago, strawberries came out. Well, when strawberries come out in British Columbia in January, they die later in January when the cold weather comes back. The same thing that happened with our apple crop in 2012. We lost 80%. That's called false springs. That means the migration of trees and plants north to warmer is canceled by the fact that we've so destabilized our springs, changed our jet stream, changed the polar vortex because of a warmer Arctic, destabilized the basic climate, destabilized climate in a way that spring doesn't work, to the point at the other end of the season, at the other end of the country. You remember the last week of May and the last week of June in Halifax, they had 4 meters of snow that fell on the streets of St. John's in Halifax. That's winter in June, that's not spring. So it's the disruption and the destruction of our seasons that's already well in play. And remember, the 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide that takes us past the danger zone into this existential crisis happened last year. And that's a 60-year play. So when you hear our Premier and our government in Ontario saying this is an existential crisis, that's what we mean. And so when we're talking about simple measures like cap and trade or putting a price on carbon, starting to have a polluter pay principle, we're doing it not because we want to be a pain in the neck to people, but because we think that this is the foundation of a building blocks. And there's two bills in the legislature that if you want to write down the numbers, look at them, because they're probably the two most important pieces of economic legislation, but they're both put into the House by the Ministry of the Environment, which will tell you something. One is Bill 151, which is called the Circular Economy Bill, and the Waste-Free Ontario Bill. That changes the foundation of the resource inputs into our economy from where they are right now, which is mostly extraction of virgin resources, to being almost entirely recovered resources. So there's enough aluminum right now to run an aluminum smelter, which we share one with Quebec. If we just captured any reasonable part of the amount of aluminum in our recycling and waste stream, we could run that entire Alcan smelter that provides our auto sector, our beverage industry with most of its aluminum, entirely from recovered materials. And because aluminum is perpetually reprocessable, never degrades, we forever could be running our aluminum smelters on recovered materials, which means they'd only use 5% of the energy they use right now. Massive productivity, massive reduction in costs, massive reduction in energy consumption. We have 3 steel mills in Ontario that operate 100% already on recovered steel. So it's changing waste into a resource stream, and that's one. The other one is Bill 172, which is the cap and trade system. And so why didn't we just do a carbon tax, put a price on carbon? Well, the great work that Mark Descartes shows that, you need $160 a ton. How does the cap and trade system work? Well, you need a big, stable economy, because cap and trade just isn't about reducing emissions. It's about greening your supply chain. It's about creating a low-carbon economy. So we looked around North America. We looked at all the states that voted for Donald Trump, and we said, maybe not those, not so green. And we sort of said, who are our friends in the North American economy? And we came up with 3. California with Governor Brown, Quebec with Premier Couillard, and Mexico. Environmental Secretary Rudolph Alesi, and we said, could we create a carbon market where we would allow companies, we'd put a price on carbon, we'd put caps on how much they could emit. If they come under those caps, they could sell those emissions to companies that couldn't do it. Because what we want is not just transformation in Ontario, we want the entire continent to be a low-carbon economy. And there's different strengths in each of the economies to achieve different kinds of reductions. We closed our coal plants very quickly. That gave us the largest reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. California is leading in electric vehicle standards, which is allowing us to build electric vehicles here to create a supply chain for the California economy, which is bigger than the Canadian economy, to supply them with those vehicles. So we're shifting the economy, and it's got to be trade-based, right? Large, stable economy means that businesses have more choices in how they can reduce emissions, and when they can't, they have more people who they can buy credits from who are. And also, the sooner you do it, credits are lower. Right now, it costs you about $17 a ton on these markets to get a permit to pollute, which is basically what allowance is. We restrict those every year, so every year there's a smaller pool of permits to pollute between Quebec, Ontario, and California, which means the price of them goes up. The people that are still polluting in 2 years will pay more. The people who are polluting more in 5 years will pay even more than that, and that builds in a huge disincentive. But at the same time, it's a market, right? So it's driving innovation. Where a carbon with a cap and trade system, we are guaranteed by a cap decline rate. Ontario has legislated GHG reductions by controlling that pool of allowances will reduce by 4.17% per year. Twice the rate, by the way, that California or Quebec are reducing those rates. So we're guaranteed to meet our emissions reductions. But to do that, we want capital inflow. So that $1.9 billion that comes from all of the pollution, all of that price that is set at market through demand and supply for permits to pollute, sets the price that gets applied to everything from fossil fuels to large emitters like cement plants. That money comes back in, and then that money is going to come to you. So you can go and buy an electric vehicle in Ontario. Anyone know what you get back from the government of Ontario? Anyone know? You should know. It's a pretty sweet deal. Yeah? Yeah, it's way better, $14,000. Just go and see what a Chevy Spark will cost you. Just saying, you could almost get a car for free. It's like winning the lottery, But so why are we doing that? Because we have to. 35% of our emissions comes from transportation, about 20% from buildings. In Toronto, it's about downtown here in the 2030 zone, it's about 37% from natural gas. So we're going to have to put money into businesses and into homes to help people take out the natural gas heating, cooling system and replace it with geothermal or deep lake cooling or batteries to get it off peak to use that. We've cleaned up our energy grid where about 98% of our energy sources now are non-emitting. So when you plug your electric car in, you're not plugging into a coal plant, you're plugging into a wind turbine or a nuclear plant or a hydro dam or a solar field. So that's the kind of change that we've really been driving, but that's the shift. And it's about as much as moving to the low carbon economy, which is a $6 trillion expansion. So how do we do this next? Well, massive investments in public transit, which isn't coming from cap and trade. That's $160 billion, which is, we haven't seen that level of spending since the 1950s and 60s when we first built our subways under Premiers Drew and Premiers Frost and Robarts and others. We were down in the previous governments in the 90s and 10 years ago to as little as $1 billion a year. So now we're up at 13, 14, $15 billion a year. That's the level of investment you need. We're electrifying the whole GO system, running our GO trains every 15 minutes. So you don't, like a surface subway, we're investing in subway and LRT expansions. But we're also investing in autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles and putting electric charging stations. We're about to transform the urban and suburban landscape around that, and that's important. But we need that. So what are some of the things that we could do? I want to leave you with two ideas and then we'll go to questions. One of them is, why not have a zero zone somewhere? Right now, I have a friend who's building a building called Mimico on the Go. This is a net zero condo building right on a GO station. Can you get greener than that? I don't think so. Ground source heat pumps, green water. He tells me that with the City of Toronto, it costs him $5 million more to pay for natural gas lines and all the hookups of stuff the building doesn't use, right? But he has to, for his future residents who will call this building home, it costs about $6 million in gray water and geothermal and batteries and all of solar chimneys and all the things that are going into this building. So we can't have people double pay for green buildings when people who build brown buildings get off scot-free. So how do we normalize that? And in the interim, maybe we just have to declare a district. Maybe it's part of the district that's 2030 and say, this is a zero zone. It's zero in two ways. Zero, you bring forward a plan for a net zero building that's aesthetically pleasing and sustainable. And in this zone, if you can do that with zero emissions, we'll look at that on a planning basis. When I was mayor of Winnipeg, we did a zero zone to restore a heritage district. Said, you come up with the greatest ways that you can adaptively reuse a landfill site or repurpose an old Edwardian warehouse or an old Victorian bank building, and it was amazing. We went from a vacancy rate of 68% to a vacancy rate of 8% in that district in less than 4 years because we had financial incentives that matched that. Well, that's where that $1.9 billion. So maybe the downtown residents, environmental activists, urbanists, cyclists, business leaders, business managers, investors, financiers, my friend Howard Brown, who's the most influential consultant in downtown Toronto. We call him Downtown Howard Brown. The engineers or the architects and all of my friends out there, healthcare professionals, can drive this idea that we have an innovation zone where we try to solve these problems with innovation, not regulation. Maybe we take something else, what Peter Kelly did in Halifax, where he said, before you add another kilometer of pipe or a kilometer of road, you should demonstrate that you've exhausted all the infill opportunities, that every GO station, every subway station is fully developed out, that every brownfield has been repurposed. So reuse and repurpose assets before you extend cities. I mean, this is very consistent with what Places to Grow says. Could we invigorate that? And the evidence of that from a fiscal perspective is interesting, because when I first became transportation minister and infrastructure minister before I was environment minister, I had a little exercise. I mapped out the entire GTHA. I had John Liu as an assistant deputy minister, brilliant guy. And I said, tell me, from Hamilton to Scarborough and up to Markham in North Toronto, how many dollars go into every type of neighborhood, every neighborhood that come out? And it was interesting, like in downtown Hamilton, which you'd think was an old urban core, would probably have paid its infrastructure, but Downtown Hamilton has so much surface parking right now and such a weak tax base and so much infrastructure that's underutilized. Hamilton actually absorbs more tax dollars than it pays out, right? Where downtown Toronto, the opposite, massive, $10, $20 per square foot for every dollar in services that we get. Not a lot of new infrastructure in downtown Toronto, but we certainly have an expanding tax base. Scarborough used to be a tax engine. Scarborough has lost a lot of its commercial base. Markham, big commercial base, higher density, now a tax engine. Whether I won't mention them, but other suburbs within the 905 who have very low density, lots of infrastructure, lots of flyover, intersections, not much commercial base, long commutes for people there, high amount of cost for infrastructure, not a lot of tax base locally to pay for it. So there's an issue of environmental and fiscal sustainability all being the same thing. So if we actually just look at measures of dollars in, dollars out, how much infrastructure, how much energy do we use to heat every square meter and to manage every square meter? How many of us can walk to work or use active transportation or cycling? Use much more productive moves of transportation and that. And when we do drive a car, we're experimenting with autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles where a car would be used 20 hours a day and rest for 2 instead of being used for 2 and resting for 20. So that's what I mean by productivity of assets. You may notice the 15-minute GO service isn't just about 15-minute electrified GO service. It means that those trains, when they run every 15 minutes, rather than, and there are only 3 or 6 cars and they're like a subway, are different than trains that run 10 or 12 car diesel trains that run every half hour. Right now, the GO system supports 60 million rides a year. When we electrify it, and over the next 10, 15 years, the entire system is electrified and runs on 15-minute service, it runs it serves 200 million people. On the same tracks, with just simply a different train technology, we go from 60 million rides a year to 200 million. We go from a publicly subsidized utility to a profitable utility without raising fares. We're improving service, right? Because the frequency, the value that's being created in value planning and value captures that. And it also means that if you're in Oshawa or Oakville, that's as frequently served as Union Station is. So Oakville can have its own downtown, which is what they did in Vancouver. If you go to Surrey or to Burnaby, you'll see secondary downtowns that have emerged, and we need to do that in the GTA. So rezoning and connecting land use, all of that will reduce our GHG emissions in dramatic ways. But government's leadership doesn't work without followership. So you got to be brave and bold followers with dynamic ideas, intelligent, thoughtful people who are more than taxpayers, and which I hate when people call you taxpayers, and more than voters. A little fonder when they call you voters. Please do get out that, do that on a regular basis. But you're really citizens. We have complex relationships. We're a highly educated society. We expect governments not just to simply condescend to us and tell us what to do. So be a constituency for the ideas and the champions in politics of things you believe in, but expect those same institutions, your government and your politicians, to be your constituency and followership for the things that you want to lead. I am very happy being a follower. I always say politics and leadership is often about, follow me, I'm right behind you. Do you know what I mean? And my job as a politician, when there's brave leadership out of downtown Toronto in my constituency to create maybe a net zero zone and create an environment for innovation rather than regulation, is to stand behind you and support your ideas, stand beside you as your friend and mentor, and to be mentored by you when we have to create change together. And when the bullets start flying, my job is to stand in front of you and protect you from those bullets. That's the relationship that you should have with your elected official. When you need us to lead, stand with us, stand behind us. Do not, when the bullets fly during questions here, ever stand in front of us. But in every other situation, expect us to do all those things for you. And this town hall tonight and the great meeting that happened is the foundation of building that new house. So let's not think small. There is really no time left for small ideas. We have little runway to beat this. The bad news is Ontario will be 4 degrees warmer in southern Ontario. It will be 8 degrees warmer in northern Ontario. What that means for our Arctic, for our Great Lakes, for our moose, for our food supply, for our food security, for our water security is terrible. We cannot weep in our tap water anymore. We have to act now because we are the last generation in this room that will have known a normal climate. Our children are the first generation that will never know a normal climate. And the next 3 decades are the most important in human history. We will either rise to big ideas, transformative change, embrace hope, live life for the people we love and the things we hope for passionately, or we will diminish ourselves and live our lives for the things that we fear and the people we're afraid of. And we can't do that. We really need to write a very big, bold, transformative narrative, and that's each and every one of you has to become uppity, never irrational, but feel free to be completely unreasonable in your demands. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. And we'll go